It's now 40 years since a Catholic priest and a group of Christian brothers began abusing young boys in the Ballarat region. But even now, shocking details are still emerging. A police officer investigating the pedophile ring says up to 30 students have committed suicide since being abused. That's prompted calls for a parliamentary inquiry into the deaths and the Catholic Church's handling of child abuse. Danny Morgan has this report.
I grew up in Ballarat East. I went to a school called St Alipius. What's obviously come out now that there was a pedophile network at that school. From grade 5, 6, primarily in those 2 years I was abused.
Everybody was scared, but you didn't have an idea of the extent. You didn't know that sometimes there would be 20 kids from a class would be molested.
The sad and sorry history of St Alipius Catholic Boys' School is again making headlines. In the Victorian County Court this week, the school's former principal, Brother Robert Best, fronted a pre-sentence hearing after being convicted of sexually abusing 11 boys at 3 different schools between 1969 and 1988. This man, who asked not to be identified, was one of his victims.
At the time, it was bewildering because you were too young to understand.
Guilty, and he knew.
Stephen Woods says he too was sexually abused by members of the pedophile network at St Alipius.
I wanted to speak to somebody who could help me, who could support me through issues I was having. And lo and behold, Father Ridsdale was there. And within half an hour of going there, he had me up at the lake and he was raping me.
Father Gerald Ridsdale was later jailed for sexually assaulting dozens of students in various parishes around Victoria in the 1960s, 70s and 80s. 2 other Christian brothers who taught at St Alipius have also been convicted of abusing young boys.
Unfortunately, it's probably always going to be that when you mention paedophilia in the church, in the Diocese of Ballarat, St Alipius will be mentioned, because it has been in the past so prevalent here.
Although some of the assaults are now more than 40 years old, the pain and suffering continues. In court this week, Best's victims spoke about what happened to them at schools like St Alipius here in Ballarat. They said the abuse had robbed them of their childhood. Many have since had trouble forming stable relationships. Some have turned to alcohol and drugs. And one man told the court he had attempted to take his own life. Detective Sergeant Kevin Carson has spent much of the past decade investigating the complaints against Best. From his time at St Alipius and then at subsequent postings to St Leo's College in Box Hill and St Joseph's College in Geelong.
Anyone that saw those victims give their evidence the other day could not possibly be moved.
Another of Best's alleged victims didn't make it to trial. He committed suicide in 2009 after giving evidence at the first court hearing.
Having talked him into making a statement really hurts when he took his life.
He was in my class, I knew him well. Best abused him in a number of ways.
Kevin Carson says it's an all-too-common tale among boys taught by Best, Ridsdale and company.
Very, very sadly, it's well and truly over 20, closer to 30.
This man says there have been 3 suicides in his own family and agrees the wider total may be up around 30.
I believe there's 5 suicides just in my class.
Kevin Carson says many of those who have died grew up around Ballarat. The rest came from other towns and cities around Victoria.
Generally all over the place. And no doubt there'll be more once you start looking a bit.
That's prompted victims to call for an inquiry into the deaths.
How many, I think, needs to be investigated. I believe that we should be able to say, OK, this is where this pedophile taught at this school. You know, let's look at this, let's analyse it, let's come forward and say, OK, this is where we need to go, this is what needs to be done.
What purpose would that achieve?
Healing, obviously healing, and we can't, nobody as a Christian, nobody as a Catholic can surely sit back and say, this is acceptable.
You're saying aside from...
The Bishop of Ballarat, Peter Connors, says he's also aware some victims have killed themselves.
I might have heard from time to time when individuals committed suicide.
Is that worth investigating?
I think if people feel that will assist the healing process, I would certainly encourage that to take place, and I would cooperate with any inquiry.
Others are calling for a wider inquiry into the way the Catholic Church handles complaints of sexual abuse. In court this week, one of Robert Best's victims expressed anger at the fact the Christian brother wasn't kicked out of the order after he was first convicted of indecently assaulting a student in 1996.
The Church's support for this sadistic monster during his career and later during his defence demonstrates complicity in the assaults. This denial and affront to justice by a supposedly just church is deeply offensive to me. It's disgusting.
In a statement, the Christian Brothers say by keeping Best in the order, they are performing a service to the community. Because if the now 70-year-old is ever released from prison, he will be monitored rather than let loose in the community with access to minors. Victorian Labor MP Anne Barker became concerned about pedophilia within the church after hearing the story of two girls abused by a Catholic priest in her electorate of Oakley.
There is evidence that has come out and is coming out that shows that there was knowledge of these pedophile priests.
The government has got to be involved. It's the days of the church and the bishops being a law unto themselves is ending.
Anne Barker says Victoria should look to Ireland, where the Parliament has commissioned investigations into child abuse within the Catholic Church. Bishop Connors isn't so sure.
I do believe here in Australia we adopted procedures which enabled us to be able to respond in an appropriate way to victims. Nothing's ideal, but we certainly have done far better than they have in Ireland.
He was in the presbytery.
Stephen Woods has long called for an inquiry into child abuse within the church and says it's not too late to start now.
If it all came out, all hell would break loose because the sheer number of victims and the sheer amount of assaults and rapes and that went on is just hideous.
Kevin Carson is still looking into complaints from men who were sexually assaulted by Catholic priests and brothers as young boys. He says an inquiry into why so many have suicided is needed.
It's all for the kids. It's all for kids to make sure the kids are safe. That's all we're after. Make sure they're safe.
Victoria's Attorney-General Robert Clark says he's seeking advice on the need for an inquiry. And those needing to talk to someone can phone Victoria's suicide helpline on 1300 651 251.